Hello everyone, and welcome to another journey into the unknown. This is your host, and you have found your way to Forbidden Mysteries. I know many of you use these stories to help you drift into peaceful sleep. So before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest mysteries. I would love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below and let me know. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind prepare to wander into the mysteries that lie just beyond our understanding. My name is Gabriel Parker, and I am a landscape photographer based out of Flagstaff, Arizona. I have been capturing the natural beauty of the Southwest for over 15 years now, and I thought I had seen everything these red rock formations could offer. I was wrong. What happened to me on a September evening in 2019 near Sedona changed everything I believed about what might exist beyond our world. I had driven down to Sedona that afternoon with plans to photograph the famous Bell Rock Formation during the golden hour. The drive from Flagstaff takes about an hour, and I always enjoyed that winding descent through Oak Creek Canyon, watching the landscape transform from pine forest to the otherworldly red rock country that makes Sedona so famous. I had my usual gear with me, my Canon 5D Mark IV, a selection of lenses, my sturdy Gitzo tripod, and enough battery packs to last through a long night of shooting. Sedona attracts photographers from around the world, and for good reason. The red sandstone formations create some of the most dramatic landscapes in North America. Cathedral Rock, Bell Rock, Courthouse Butte. These monuments rise from the desert floor like ancient temples, their surfaces painted in shades of crimson and orange that seem to glow from within. I had photographed all of these landmarks countless times, but that day I was feeling adventurous. Instead of heading to the usual tourist spots, I decided to explore some of the more remote areas where I might capture something unique. I parked my Jeep at a pullout about 3 miles past Bell Rock, where a rough dirt road led deeper into the desert. The sun was still high, so I had time to scout locations before the light became interesting. I hiked about half a mile from the road, following a dry wash that wound between towering red buttes. The silence out there was profound. No traffic sounds, no voices, just the occasional whisper of wind through the sagebrush and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk. I found the perfect spot on a slight rise that gave me a clear view toward Cathedral Rock in the distance, with layers of red formations creating depth in my composition. I set up my tripod and camera, checked my settings, and waited for the magic hour when the setting sun would paint those rocks with the warm light that photographers live for. The golden hour in Sedona is truly spectacular. As the sun dropped toward the western horizon, the red rocks began to glow as if lit from within. I worked steadily, adjusting my composition, changing lenses, capturing the subtle shifts in color and shadow as the light evolved. This is why I became a photographer. These moments when the natural world reveals its hidden beauty. As the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains, I packed away my telephoto lens and mounted my wide angle for some twilight shots. The sky was clear, painted in deep blues and purples, with the first stars beginning to appear. Venus hung low on the western horizon, brilliant and steady. I was completely absorbed in my work, lost in the meditative process of capturing the landscape as day transitioned to night. That is when I noticed the light. At first, I thought it was Venus, but Venus was clearly visible in the west. This new light appeared in the north, much brighter than any planet, with a slight pulsing quality that immediately caught my attention. I lowered my camera and watched this light for several minutes. It was not moving like an airplane. There were no navigation lights, no sound, and it seemed to hover in one position above the red rock formations. I attached my longest lens, a 400mm telephoto, and tried to get a closer look through my viewfinder. The light appeared to be perfectly round, with a soft white glow that pulsed gently. growing brighter and dimmer in a slow rhythm. I had photographed countless aircraft over the years, jets leaving vapor trails, helicopters with their distinctive navigation lights, even military aircraft from the nearby bases. This was none of those things. As I watched, the light began to move. Not the straight line movement of an aircraft, but something more organic, almost like it was drifting on invisible currents. It moved slowly toward the east, following the contours of the red rock formations. I managed to capture several long exposures, hoping my camera might record details my eyes could not detect. Then, the impossible happened. The light descended. I watched through my telephoto lens as this brilliant object dropped slowly toward the desert floor, coming to rest behind a formation about a quarter mile from my position. The pulsing glow continued now, partially obscured by the red rocks but still clearly visible. My heart was racing. Every instinct told me to pack up and leave, but my photographer's curiosity won out. I had to know what this was. I left most of my gear at my shooting position, but took my camera with the telephoto lens attached. The terrain was rough, full of loose rocks and desert vegetation, but I made my way carefully toward where I had seen the light descend. The pulsing glow served as my beacon, guiding me through the darkness. As I got closer, I could see that the light was coming from behind a large red rock outcropping. I climbed carefully up the side of this formation, my camera ready. When I reached a point where I could see over the rocks, I stopped breathing. There, in a small clearing surrounded by red rock walls, sat an object unlike anything I had ever seen. It was roughly disc-shaped, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with a smooth metallic surface that reflected the starlight. The pulsing glow emanated from the entire craft, not from any specific lights or windows. The object hovered about 3 feet above the desert floor, completely silent. I raised my camera with trembling hands and began to photograph. The autofocus struggled in the dim light, so I switched to manual focus and did my best to capture what I was witnessing. Through my viewfinder, I could see incredible detail. The craft's surface appeared to have a pattern of symbols or markings, geometric designs that seemed to shift and flow as I watched. I shot an entire battery pack, maybe 60 exposures, trying different settings to capture both the craft and the strange symbols on its surface. The pulsing light made exposure challenging. I had to time my shots for the brighter pulses to get enough illumination. After perhaps 10 minutes, the craft began to rise. The pulsing glow intensified, and I felt a strange tingling sensation in the air, like the buildup before a lightning storm. I continued photographing as the object descended, watching through my lens as it climbed silently into the star-filled sky. Within moments, it was just another point of light among the stars, and then it was gone. I stayed there for another hour, hoping it might return, but the desert had returned to its normal nighttime calm. Finally, I made my way back to my gear and packed everything carefully. My hands were still shaking as I loaded my equipment into the Jeep. The drive back to Flagstaff was surreal. I kept replaying what I had witnessed, trying to make sense of it. Had I really seen an extraterrestrial craft? The rational part of my mind searched for conventional explanations, experimental aircraft, some kind of drone, atmospheric phenomena. But I knew what I had seen, and it defied all conventional explanation. When I returned home, I immediately downloaded the images from my camera. Most of the shots were disappointing. The low light and my nervous excitement had resulted in blurry or poorly exposed images. But 3 photographs clearly showed the disc-shaped object and its strange geometric markings. The symbols appeared to be burned or etched into the craft's surface, forming complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. I debated for weeks about what to do with these images. I knew that going public would invite ridicule and potentially damage my reputation as a serious photographer, but I also felt a responsibility to document what I had witnessed. 2 months later, curiosity got the better of me, and I returned to the site with better equipment and a plan for a more systematic investigation. I found the clearing where the craft had hovered, and what I discovered there removed any remaining doubt about what had occurred. The ground showed clear signs of intense heat. The desert sand had been fused into glass-like patches, forming a circular pattern about 30 feet in diameter. More striking were the symbols. Burned into the hard-pan desert floor were the same geometric patterns I had seen on the craft's surface. These markings were burned deep into the earth, as if created by tremendous heat focused with laser precision. I photographed everything meticulously, documenting the burn patterns and the strange symbols. I also collected samples of the fused sand and the surrounding soil. When I had these samples analyzed by a friend who works in material science, the results were puzzling. The fused areas showed evidence of exposure to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But there were also unusual trace elements that had no business being in Arizona desert soil. I have returned to that site many times since then, always hoping to witness another encounter. The symbols remain, though they have faded somewhat due to wind erosion. I have never seen the craft again, but I have noticed other strange lights in the Sedona area during my night photography sessions. I eventually decided to share my story and photographs with a few UFO research organizations. The response was mixed. Some dismissed my account as a hoax, while others found it compelling evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. I do not claim to know what I encountered that night. I only know that it changed my perspective on our place in the universe. As a photographer, I have spent my career capturing the beauty and mystery of the natural world. But nothing I have ever photographed compares to that silent, glowing craft hovering in the Sedona desert. Sometimes I wonder if those beings, whoever they were, chose that location specifically because of its otherworldly beauty. Perhaps they were drawn to the same red rock formations that attract photographers and spiritual seekers from around the world. The photographs remain the best evidence I have of that extraordinary encounter. They serve as a reminder that our universe holds mysteries far beyond our current understanding, and that sometimes, if we are very fortunate, we might catch a glimpse of wonders that exist just beyond the boundaries of our everyday experience. My name is Travis Doyle, and I live in Keene, New Hampshire, with my wife Brianna. We have been married for 12 years now, and what I am about to tell you happened during our third year of marriage, in October of 2014. I work as a software engineer for a small tech company in Manchester, and Brianna teaches 4th grade at our local elementary school. We are rational, educated people who never believed in anything supernatural or extraterrestrial. That changed on a foggy night when we were driving home from visiting Brianna's parents in Colebrook. The visit had gone longer than expected. Brianna's father had been diagnosed with diabetes earlier that year, and her mother needed help understanding all the dietary changes and medication schedules. We spent the entire weekend organizing pill containers, creating meal plans, and setting up a system to help them manage his condition. By Sunday evening, we were both exhausted, but satisfied that we had made a real difference in their daily routine. We finally left Colebrook around 9:30 at night, much later than we had planned. The drive from Colebrook to Keene normally takes about 2.5 hours, following Route 3 south through Franconia Notch, and then picking up Route 104 west toward our home. It is a beautiful drive during the day, winding through the White Mountains with spectacular views of the peaks and valleys. At night, however, especially in October, when the fog rolls in from the valleys, it can be challenging and somewhat eerie. Brianna had packed some snacks and coffee in a thermos. Knowing we would be making this late drive, I was alert and felt confident about the journey ahead. The first hour passed without incident. We talked about her parents, made plans for the upcoming work week, and listened to a podcast about sustainable living that Brianna had discovered. The traffic was light, as expected for a Sunday night in rural New Hampshire. As we entered Franconia Notch, the fog began to thicken considerably. I slowed our Honda Accord to about 40 miles per hour and turned on the fog lights. The familiar landmarks of the Notch, the Cannon Mountain Tramway, the Profile Lake, the Old Man viewing area were all shrouded in thick swirling mist. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet in front of our headlights. That is when Brianna first noticed the light. "Travis, look up ahead," she said, pointing through the windshield. "Do you see that glow?" I squinted through the fog and could make out a soft yellowish light above the road ahead of us. At first, I assumed it was the lights from the Cannon Mountain ski area, or perhaps a cell tower beacon cutting through the mist. "Probably just some facility lights reflecting off the fog," I told her, but I found myself slowing down even more as we approached the source of the glow. As we rounded a curve near the Flume Gorge area, the light became much more pronounced. It was not reflecting off the fog. It was above the fog, perhaps 200 feet in the air, and it was moving slowly in the same direction we were traveling. The light had an unusual quality to it, almost like it was pulsing very gently, growing slightly brighter and dimmer in a slow rhythm. "That is definitely not normal," Brianna said, rolling down her passenger window to get a better look. "It is way too big to be a helicopter, and there is no sound at all." She was right about the silence. Even with the window down, we could hear nothing but our own engine and the whisper of fog drifting across the road. Whatever was creating that light was moving completely silently through the night sky. I pulled over at a scenic overlook near Profile Lake, and we both got out of the car to observe this phenomenon more closely. The fog was patchy here, thick in some areas but thin enough in others to give us occasional clear views of the sky above. What we saw defied any rational explanation. The light source appeared to be coming from some kind of structured object. Through the shifting fog, we could make out what looked like a dark, elongated shape with the yellowish glow emanating from multiple points along its surface. The object was much larger than any aircraft I had ever seen, easily the size of a football field, and it moved with a fluid, almost organic motion that no conventional aircraft could achieve. "We should take some pictures," Brianna suggested, reaching for her phone. But when she tried to activate the camera, the phone screen remained black. She pressed the power button repeatedly, but nothing happened. I pulled out my own phone and encountered the same problem. Both devices appeared to be completely dead, even though they had been fully charged when we left Colebrook. Even stranger, the digital clock on our car dashboard was flickering randomly, showing different times that made no sense. We stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, watching this massive, silent object drift slowly southward above the fog layer. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably while we were observing it, and we both began to feel an odd tingling sensation in the air, similar to the feeling you get just before a lightning strike. "I think we should get back in the car," I said, suddenly feeling very exposed and vulnerable standing in that open area. Brianna nodded immediately. She had been thinking the same thing. As we drove away from the overlook, continuing south on Route 3, the object seemed to pace us, maintaining its position above and slightly ahead of our car. The fog made it difficult to track consistently, but every time we reached a clear area, there it was, that soft yellow glow keeping pace with our progress. About 15 minutes later, near the town of Lincoln, I began to feel drowsy in a way that made no sense. I'd not been tired at all when we stopped to observe the object, and I had consumed plenty of caffeine during our drive. But now I was struggling to keep my eyes open, fighting against a heavy, almost hypnotic sleepiness. "Brianna, I need you to help keep me awake," I said. But when I glanced over at her, she was already asleep in the passenger seat. Her head was tilted back against the headrest, and she was breathing deeply and evenly, as if she had been sleeping for hours. The last thing I remember clearly was seeing a road sign for Ashland, still about 40 miles from home. I recall thinking that I needed to find a place to pull over and rest, but the drowsiness was becoming overwhelming. I remember the steering wheel feeling heavy in my hands, and then everything went blank. The next thing I knew, I was waking up behind the wheel of our parked car in our own driveway in Keene. Weak morning sunlight was filtering through the fog, and according to our car's clock, which was now working normally again. It was 6:15 in the morning. Brianna was just waking up beside me, looking as confused and disoriented as I felt. "How did we get home?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "The last thing I remember was seeing that strange light near Lincoln." I checked the odometer and found that we had driven exactly the right number of miles from Colebrook to our house. Everything appeared normal, except for the fact that neither of us could remember the last hour and a half of our drive. We had somehow safely navigated 35 miles of winding mountain roads while both of us were unconscious, and we had no memory of it whatsoever. Inside the house, we discovered other puzzling details. Our phones, which had been completely dead during our encounter, were now working perfectly and showed full battery charge. More disturbing were our physical conditions. We both felt dirty in a way that made no sense. We had showered at her parents' house before leaving, and we had been sitting in our car all night. Yet we both felt an urgent need to shower immediately. Brianna noticed at first small red marks on her arms that looked like tiny puncture wounds or insect bites, but arranged in perfectly straight lines of 3 marks each. When I examined my own arms and torso, I found similar marks. We had no memory of being bitten by insects or injured in any way, and the marks were too precise and geometric to be from any normal source. Over the following weeks, we both experienced vivid, disturbing dreams that seemed more like memories than normal dream content. In these dreams, we remembered being led from our car by tall, thin figures with large, dark eyes. We remembered lying on tables in a brightly lit, sterile environment, while these beings conducted some kind of examination using instruments that we could not identify. The dreams were remarkably consistent between us. We would compare notes each morning and find that we had dreamed almost identical scenarios. The same room, the same beings, the same procedures. Brianna remembered being shown a series of images that seemed to be star charts or navigation maps. I recalled being asked questions through some form of telepathic communication about human behavior and emotions. After 2 months of these recurring dreams and increasing anxiety about what we might have experienced, we decided to seek professional help. We contacted Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a psychologist in Manchester who specialized in trauma and had some experience with unusual memory issues. Dr. Martinez was initially skeptical about hypnotic regression, but agreed to work with us when she observed the genuine distress our missing memories were causing. The hypnosis sessions, conducted over several weeks, revealed detailed memories that neither of us could access through normal consciousness. Under hypnosis, we both described being taken from our car near the town of Woodstock, about halfway between Lincoln and our home in Keene. We remembered our car being surrounded by a bright light that seemed to come from directly above. The beings who approached our car were approximately 6 feet tall, with gray-colored skin and disproportionately large heads. Their eyes were dark and much larger than human eyes, and they communicated with us without speaking, somehow placing thoughts and instructions directly into our minds. We felt no fear during the actual encounter. We both described feeling calm and compliant, as if we had been given some kind of sedative. We were taken to what appeared to be a medical facility aboard some kind of craft. The walls, floors, and ceiling all seemed to be made of the same smooth metallic material, and the lighting came from the surfaces themselves rather than from any visible fixtures. We were examined separately, and the procedures seemed focused on collecting samples and taking measurements. Most disturbing were the questions they asked us about human relationships, emotions, and social structures. Through the telepathic communication, they seemed particularly interested in understanding concepts like love, loyalty, and family bonds. They asked us about our decision to marry each other, about our feelings toward Brianna's parents, and about our plans for having children. The final part of our recovered memories involved being shown images of Earth from space, with particular focus on populated areas and transportation systems. One of the beings communicated to us that they were studying human civilization and trying to understand how our species had developed such complex social structures. They seemed genuinely curious about us, not hostile, but their clinical approach to examining us was deeply unsettling. When the examinations were complete, we were returned to our car. The beings somehow made us forget the encounter until we could process it gradually through dreams and eventual hypnotic recall. They seemed to understand that immediate, conscious memory of such an experience would be too traumatic for us to handle. Dr. Martinez was careful to emphasize that hypnotic regression is not a perfect tool for recovering accurate memories. She explained that hypnosis can sometimes create false memories or blend real experiences with fantasy. However, she was impressed by the consistency and detail of our separate accounts, and she noted that we displayed many symptoms consistent with people who had experienced genuine trauma. We have shared our story with a few close friends and family members, but the reactions have been mixed. Some people dismiss it as imagination or false memories. Others, particularly Brianna's father, have been surprisingly supportive. He told us that he had his own unusual sighting in the same area back in the 1970s, but he had never reported it or discussed it with anyone. We returned to the Woodstock area several times over the following months, trying to find physical evidence of our encounter. We found nothing definitive, but we did discover that several other people in the region had reported unusual lights and missing time experiences along the same stretch of Route 3. There seems to be something about that particular area that attracts these phenomena. The experience has changed our perspective on our place in the universe. We no longer assume that humans are alone or that our understanding of reality is complete. We have become more open to possibilities that we would have dismissed as impossible before that foggy October night. We have also become closer as a couple. Sharing such an extraordinary experience, whether real or imagined, has created a bond between us that is difficult to explain to others. We still drive that route when we visit Brianna's parents, though we now always make sure to travel during daylight hours. We have never seen the mysterious lights again, but we remain alert to the possibility. Sometimes, late at night, when the fog rolls through our valley in Keene, we both find ourselves looking up at the sky and wondering what else might be out there, watching us from beyond the mist. My name is Stephen Allen, and I am a pilot and freight company owner from Selden, Texas, just outside of Stephenville. I have been flying for over 25 years, logging thousands of hours in everything from single-engine Cessnas to twin-engine cargo planes. I thought I had seen everything the sky had to offer until January 8th, 2008, when I witnessed something that defied every principle of aerodynamics I had ever learned. That evening started like any other winter day in Erith County. I had spent most of the afternoon working on clearing brush from a hilltop on my property, preparing to build a new hangar for my freight business. The sun was setting around 6 o'clock, painting the Texas sky in those brilliant oranges and purples that make this part of the country so beautiful. I was getting ready to pack up my tools when my friend Mike called to invite me over to his place for a campfire and some conversation. Mike's property sits on a hill about 3 miles from my place, with a clear view in all directions across the rolling countryside. It is the perfect spot for watching aircraft, and we often spend evenings there, identifying the various military and civilian planes that pass through our airspace. Living so close to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we see everything from commercial airliners at high altitude to military training flights from the nearby Naval Air Station. When I arrived at Mike's place around 6:30, he and his neighbor Lance were already building a fire pit. The evening was clear and cold, perfect for spending time outdoors. We had been talking for maybe 10 minutes when I noticed something unusual in the eastern sky. At first, it appeared to be an aircraft approaching from the direction of Dallas, but the lights were wrong. Instead of the standard red and green navigation lights with a white strobe, this object displayed a series of extremely bright white lights arranged in what looked like a rectangular pattern. The lights were so intense they reminded me of arc welders. That sharp, almost painful brightness that makes your eyes water if you look directly at it. "You guys seeing this?" I asked Mike and Lance, pointing toward the approaching object. Both men looked up and immediately stood from their positions around the fire. What we were watching was unlike any aircraft we had ever seen. The object was massive. I estimated it to be at least half a mile wide and possibly a full mile in length. It moved completely silently, which was impossible for something that size. Even a large cargo plane makes considerable noise, but this thing glided through the air without producing so much as a whisper. As it passed overhead, maybe 3,000 feet above us, we could see that the lights were attached to a dark, structured craft. The shape was difficult to make out against the darkening sky, but it appeared to be triangular or diamond-shaped, with the brilliant white lights positioned at regular intervals along its edges. The craft moved steadily from east to west at what I estimated to be around 300 miles per hour. Fast for something that size, but not impossibly so. What happened next changed everything. As we watched this enormous craft continue westward, we heard the unmistakable sound of military jets approaching at high speed. Within seconds, 2 F-16 fighter jets screamed overhead, flying so low that we could feel the ground vibrate from their engines. I know F-16s well. I attend air shows regularly and can identify most military aircraft by sight and sound. These jets were in full afterburner, pushing their engines to maximum power as they pursued the mysterious craft. The contrast between the two types of aircraft was staggering. The F-16s, among the most advanced fighter jets in the world, were clearly struggling to keep pace with the silent craft ahead of them. What really shocked me was what happened when the jets got close to the object. The massive craft suddenly accelerated to an impossible speed. I am talking about instantaneous acceleration from maybe 300 miles per hour to what had to be several thousand miles per hour. The object streaked across the western sky and disappeared beyond the horizon in a matter of seconds. To put this in perspective, it takes me about 20 minutes to fly across that same section of sky in my Cessna. This thing covered that distance in maybe 5 seconds. The F-16s were left behind like they were standing still. They continued westward for a few more seconds, then turned back toward the east, apparently giving up their pursuit. The entire encounter lasted maybe 5 minutes from start to finish, but it felt like we had witnessed something that would change our understanding of what was possible. None of us spoke for several minutes after the craft disappeared. We just stood there staring at the western horizon, trying to process what we had seen. Finally, Mike broke the silence. "Stephen, you are the pilot here. What the hell was that thing?" I had no answer. In 25 years of flying, I'd never seen anything remotely like it. The size alone was impossible. There's no aircraft in existence that could be half a mile wide and still maintain controlled flight. The silent operation was equally impossible for something that massive, and the acceleration we witnessed violated every law of physics I understood. Over the following days, we learned that we were not the only witnesses to this extraordinary event. Maria Ortega, a local woman who works as a truck dispatcher, had been driving home from work when she saw the same object. She pulled over on Highway 144 and watched the craft for several minutes before the fighter jets arrived. Her description matched ours exactly. The massive size, the brilliant lights, the silent operation, and the incredible acceleration when it departed. Leroy Gaitan, a constable with the local sheriff's department, was walking to his patrol car that evening when he noticed what he described as a red glow in the sky. He said it reminded him of pictures he had seen of volcanic eruptions. A deep, fiery red light suspended about 3,000 feet in the air. Leroy called his son to come outside and witness the phenomenon, and they both watched as the object hovered motionlessly for several minutes before suddenly shooting away at tremendous speed. Within a week, Dozens of people from Stephenville and the surrounding area came forward with similar stories. The local newspaper, the Stephenville Empire Tribune, published a story about the sightings, and suddenly, our small farming community was thrust into the international spotlight. News crews from around the world descended on Stephenville, interviewing witnesses and trying to make sense of what had happened. The military's response was particularly interesting. Initially, officials at the Naval Air Station Reserve Base in Fort Worth denied that any of their aircraft were in the area that night. They suggested that what we had seen was likely an optical illusion, perhaps sunlight reflecting off commercial airliners. This explanation was absurd to anyone who had actually witnessed the event. We saw this object after sunset. It was clearly structured and under intelligent control, and multiple witnesses from different locations provided consistent descriptions. Then, 2 weeks after the initial denials, the military completely changed their story. Officials admitted that they had indeed been conducting training exercises with 10 F-16 fighter jets in the Brownwood Military Operating Area on the night of January 8th. They claimed that their initial denial was due to a communications error, a mistake that led to the dissemination of false information. This admission actually supported our story rather than debunking it. Several witnesses, including myself, had specifically reported seeing F-16s in pursuit of the unknown craft. The military's eventual acknowledgement that their jets were active in the area that night validated this crucial detail of our accounts. However, the military's explanation raised more questions than it answered. The Brownwood Military Operating Area, where they claimed to be conducting training exercises, is not the same airspace where we observed the unknown craft. The object I saw was flying well outside the designated military training zone. Additionally, the training area explanation could not account for the massive, silent craft that the F-16s appeared to be pursuing. The most compelling evidence supporting our accounts came from an unexpected source: radar data. Robert Powell, a research director with MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the Federal Aviation Administration to obtain primary radar data from 5 different antennas in the region. This data provided objective, technical corroboration of witness accounts. Powell's analysis of the radar data revealed some fascinating details. He was able to track the flight paths of the 2 F-16s using their transponder data. Military aircraft carry transponders that identify them on radar displays. But the radar also detected objects without transponders in the same area and time frame described by witnesses. According to Powell's analysis, the radar showed an unidentified object moving through airspace outside the military operating area, exactly where I had observed the massive craft. The radar track showed movement consistent with the high-speed acceleration that witnesses described. Most importantly, this object was flying in controlled airspace where any legitimate aircraft would be required to carry a transponder. The fact that it had no transponder signal suggested it was not a conventional military or civilian aircraft. The Stephenville incident became one of the most well-documented UFO cases in recent history, with multiple independent witnesses, radar corroboration, and eventually even partial military acknowledgement of unusual activity in the area. Yet despite all this evidence, no official explanation has ever been provided for what we actually saw that night. I have given this event considerable thought over the years since it occurred. As a pilot with extensive experience in aviation, I can state with absolute certainty that what we witnessed was not any conventional aircraft. The size, the silent operation, the incredible acceleration, these characteristics are simply impossible with any known technology. Some people have suggested that we witnessed a classified military aircraft, perhaps some kind of experimental craft being tested in secret. While I cannot rule out this possibility entirely, it seems unlikely for several reasons. First, conducting test flights of classified aircraft Overpopulated areas with multiple civilian witnesses would be extremely poor operational security. Second, the performance characteristics we observed, particularly the instantaneous acceleration to several thousand miles per hour, exceed anything that current human technology could achieve. The experience has changed my perspective on our place in the universe. As someone who spends considerable time studying the sky and understanding aviation technology, I'd always been skeptical of UFO reports. I assumed that most sightings could be explained by conventional aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, or simple misidentification. But after witnessing this event firsthand, and after meeting with the other credible witnesses who saw the same thing, I am convinced that we encountered something of non-human origin. The technology demonstrated by this craft, the size, the silent propulsion system, the impossible acceleration, represents capabilities far beyond anything in our current scientific understanding. I continue to fly regularly and spend many hours scanning the skies, both for my work and out of curiosity about what else might be out there. I have not seen anything similar to the January 8th craft since that night, but I remain alert to the possibility. The Stephenville incident taught me that our universe holds mysteries far greater than most people realize, and that sometimes, if we are paying attention, we might catch a glimpse of technologies and intelligences that exist far beyond our current comprehension. The radar data, the multiple witnesses, the military's eventual acknowledgement of F-16 activity. All of these elements combine to make the Stephenville case one of the most credible UFO sightings on record. We saw something extraordinary that night, something that challenges our understanding of what is possible. And despite years of analysis and investigation, no conventional explanation has ever been found for the massive silent craft that outmaneuvered our most advanced fighter jets above the Texas countryside. My name is Suzanne Dunbar, and I work as graphic designer at a small marketing firm in Van Nuys, California. What I am about to share happened in the spring of 2019, when I was working late at Woodley Elementary School on a freelance project. The school had hired me to design new promotional materials for their upcoming fundraiser, and I had arranged to use their computer lab after hours when it would be quiet and I could focus on the work without interruption. Woodley Elementary sits in a residential area of Van Nuys, surrounded by modest single-family homes and small apartment complexes. The school itself was built in the 1960s, with that typical Southern California architecture. Low, sprawling buildings connected by outdoor walkways with large windows and concrete courtyards. Behind the main campus lies a wide playground area with basketball courts, tetherball poles, and a large grassy field where the children play during recess. I'd been working at the school for about 3 weeks, coming in during the evenings after the custodial staff had finished their cleaning. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, had given me a key and the security codes so I could work at my own pace without disrupting the normal school schedule. The computer lab was perfect for what I needed. Multiple monitors, high-speed internet, and professional design software that I did not have access to at home. That particular Tuesday evening in May, I arrived at the school around 7:30, just as the last of the custodial crew was finishing up. Andre Simmons, the head janitor, was locking up the gymnasium when I pulled into the parking lot. Andre and I had developed a friendly relationship over the past few weeks. He was a gentle, soft-spoken man in his 50s who had been working at the school for over 15 years. He genuinely cared about the students and took pride in keeping their learning environment clean and safe. "Evening, Miss Dunbar," Andre called out as I gathered my laptop bag and coffee from my Honda Civic. "You working late again tonight?" "Just for a couple hours," I replied, walking toward the main entrance. "I want to finish up these brochure designs while I have some momentum going." Andre nodded and continued securing the building. The school policy required that a custodial staff member remain on campus whenever outside contractors were working in the building, so Andre would stay until I finished and locked up. He usually spent this time in his office, catching up on maintenance reports, or watching television on a small set he kept in the custodial closet. I settled into the computer lab and immediately became absorbed in my work. The fundraiser materials needed to capture the school's warm, community-focused atmosphere while also conveying the urgency of their financial needs. I was working on a series of colorful flyers featuring photographs of the students engaged in various activities: reading, playing, sports, working on art projects. Around 9:15, I took a break to stretch my legs and refill my coffee cup from the thermos I had brought. The computer lab was located on the second floor of the main building, with large windows that overlooked the playground area. As I stood at the windows, sipping my coffee and looking out at the darkened playground, I noticed something unusual in the sky above the school. At first, I thought it might be a helicopter. There was a soft, circular glow moving slowly across the night sky, perhaps 500 feet above the playground. But as I watched more carefully, I realized that this light was completely silent. Los Angeles airspace is busy with helicopters, police, news crews, medical transport, traffic monitoring, and they all make considerable noise. This light moved with the smooth, steady pace of a helicopter, but without any sound whatsoever. I opened one of the windows to get a better view and to listen for any engine noise I might have missed. The night air was warm and still, carrying the usual sounds of the suburban neighborhood: distant traffic, air conditioning units, a dog barking somewhere. But the mysterious light continued moving silently across the sky, gradually descending toward the playground area. That is when I realized this was not any conventional aircraft. The light had no shape that I could identify. It was simply a soft, yellowish glow that seemed to emanate from an invisible source. As it descended, the light grew larger and brighter, until I could see that it was actually illuminating something beneath it. There was definitely a structured object there, but the light was so bright that it obscured the details of whatever was casting it. I grabbed my phone to take some pictures, but when I tried to activate the camera, the screen remained black. The phone appeared to be completely dead, even though it had been fully charged when I arrived at school. I pressed the power button repeatedly, but nothing happened. Feeling a mixture of curiosity and growing alarm, I decided to go find Andre. His office was on the ground floor, in the basement level of the main building. I made my way quickly down the stairs, calling out his name as I went. Andre, are you down there? You need to come see something." I found him in the custodial office, sitting at his small desk, with papers spread out in front of him. When he looked up at me, I could see immediately that something was wrong. His face had gone pale, and his hands were trembling slightly. "Miss Dunbar," he said quietly, "I was just about to come find you. Something strange is happening outside." Andre led me to a basement window that provided a ground-level view of the playground. What we saw there defied every rational explanation I could think of. The mysterious object had landed on the playground, perhaps 50 yards from the school building. It sat motionlessly on the grass, illuminated by its own internal light. The craft, and it was clearly some kind of craft, was roughly disc-shaped, maybe 30 feet in diameter. The surface appeared to be metallic, with a smooth, almost mirror-like finish that reflected the yellowish light emanating from within. There were no visible windows, doors, or any other features that I could identify as being related to conventional aircraft design. But what really captured our attention were the figures moving around the craft. There were 3 of them, and they were clearly not human. Each figure stood approximately 6 feet tall, but their proportions were unlike anything I had ever seen. They appeared to be very thin, almost skeletal, with disproportionately long arms and legs. Their heads were large relative to their bodies, and even from a distance of 50 yards, I could see that their eyes were much larger than human eyes and seemed to emit a faint, bluish glow. The beings moved with a fluid, almost graceful motion as they explored the playground equipment. One of them approached the basketball court. and seemed to be examining the hoops with great interest, reaching up to touch the rim and nets. Another was investigating the tetherball poles, walking around them in slow circles and occasionally reaching out to touch the chains. The third being was focused on the jungle gym equipment. It climbed through the various bars and platforms with remarkable agility, moving in ways that suggested their joints and limbs functioned differently from human anatomy. They seemed genuinely curious about these structures, like researchers studying artifacts from an unknown civilization. Andre and I watched this incredible scene in stunned silence. Neither of us spoke for several minutes, afraid that any sound might draw attention from these otherworldly visitors. The beings continued their methodical examination of the playground equipment, occasionally communicating with each other through gestures that reminded me of sign language, but with movements that were far more fluid and complex than any human communication I had ever observed. After perhaps 10 minutes of this exploration, one of the beings approached the craft and appeared to activate some kind of control mechanism. The yellowish glow intensified, and the disc began to rise slowly from the grass. As it lifted off, I could see that it left no marks on the ground, no burn patterns, no compressed grass, no evidence whatsoever that a 30-foot craft had been resting there moments before. The beings moved with purpose now, walking toward their craft with the same graceful motion they had displayed while exploring the playground. They did not seem rushed or alarmed, merely finished with their investigation. As they reached the disc, some kind of opening appeared in its surface. Not a door that swung open, but rather a section of the hull that simply dissolved, revealing a brightly lit interior. The beings entered the craft one by one, and the opening sealed itself seamlessly behind them. The disc continued to rise, gaining altitude steadily, but still maintaining complete silence. Within moments, it had climbed to perhaps 1,000 feet above the school, where it hovered motionlessly for another minute or two. Then, without warning, the craft accelerated to an incredible speed and streaked across the night sky, disappearing beyond the horizon in a matter of seconds. The entire departure sequence, from liftoff to disappearance, took less than 5 minutes, but the acceleration phase lasted only seconds. Andre and I remained at the basement window for another hour, hoping the craft might return, but the playground had returned to its normal quiet state. Eventually, I gathered my equipment from the computer lab, and we both left the school together, neither of us speaking much about what we had witnessed. The next morning, I called the school office and asked to speak with Mrs. Rodriguez. I explained that Andre and I had witnessed something unusual the previous evening, and I asked if she had received any other reports about strange activity at the school. She told me that no one else had called, but she seemed genuinely interested in our account and asked us to come in and provide written statements. When Andre and I met with Mrs. Rodriguez that afternoon, we each wrote down detailed descriptions of what we had observed. Our accounts matched almost perfectly: the size and appearance of the craft, the number and behavior of the beings, the timeline of events, and the remarkable acceleration when the object departed. Mrs. Rodriguez was professional and respectful about our report, but she also made it clear that she did not want any publicity about the incident. Woodley Elementary had a reputation to maintain, and stories about UFO landings on school property would not be helpful for student enrollment or community relations. She asked us to keep the matter confidential, and we agreed. Over the following weeks, I found myself returning to the playground area during my evening work sessions, hoping to witness another visit from these mysterious beings. I was fascinated by their apparent interest in playground equipment and children's recreational activities. Were they studying human-child development? Were they trying to understand how our species learns and grows through play? I completed the fundraiser project successfully, and the school was pleased with the promotional materials I had created. But I found it difficult to focus on the design work, constantly distracted by thoughts about what Andre and I had witnessed. The beings had seemed so purposeful in their examination of the playground equipment, so methodical in their approach to understanding these human artifacts. Since that evening in May 2019, I have researched similar encounters and discovered that playground and school sightings are more common than most people realize. There seems to be something about educational facilities and children's play areas that attracts the attention of these visitors. Perhaps they are studying human social development, or maybe they are simply curious about how our species nurtures and educates its young. Andre and I have become good friends since sharing this extraordinary experience. We occasionally meet for coffee to discuss our ongoing thoughts about that night and to share any new information we come across about similar encounters. Neither of us has seen anything like it since, but we both remain alert to the possibility. The incident has changed my perspective on our place in the universe. As a designer, I have always been interested in how different cultures express themselves through art and architecture. Witnessing these beings and their craft gave me a profound appreciation for the possibility that intelligence and creativity exist in forms far beyond our current understanding. Sometimes, when I drive past elementary schools or see children playing on playground equipment, I wonder if those curious visitors are still out there somewhere, continuing their patient study of human civilization. The thought is both thrilling and humbling. The idea that our most innocent activities, the simple play of children, might be worthy of investigation by intelligences from beyond our world. My name is Will Thompson, and I am a fourth-generation resident of Aurora, Texas, a small farming community about 35 miles northwest of Dallas. My great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Thompson, was one of the original settlers who helped establish this town back in the 1880s, and our family has lived here continuously ever since. What I'm about to share is a story that has been passed down through 4 generations of my family, a story that most people dismiss as small-town folklore, but which I have come to believe represents one of the most significant events in American history. The story begins on the morning of April the 17th, 1897, when my great-great-grandfather witnessed what may have been the first recorded UFO crash in the United States. At that time, Aurora was a thriving railroad town with about 3,000 residents, cotton gins, flour mills, and a promising future. The Texas and Pacific Railway had brought prosperity to our community, and families like mine had established successful farms and businesses throughout the area. According to the account that Ezekiel wrote in his journal, a leather-bound book that still sits in my family's possession today, he was awakened around 6 in the morning by a tremendous explosion that shook the ground beneath his farmhouse. He initially thought it might be a boiler explosion at one of the mills, or perhaps some kind of industrial accident related to the railroad operations. Ezekiel dressed quickly and ran outside to investigate the source of the commotion. What he saw in the early morning sky defied explanation. Thick, black smoke was rising from the direction of Judge James Proctor's property, which sat on a hill about half a mile north of the town center. Mixed with the black smoke was something Ezekiel had never seen before, a shimmering, almost metallic dust that caught the morning sunlight and created an eerie rainbow-colored haze drifting across the landscape. As word of the explosion spread through the community, dozens of Aurora residents converged on Judge Proctor's property to investigate. What they found there challenged everything they understood about the world in 1897. Scattered across an area roughly the size of a football field were the remnants of some kind of flying machine, but unlike any aircraft that existed at that time. The debris consisted primarily of a metallic material that none of the townspeople could identify. Ezekiel described it in his journal as being lighter than aluminum, but stronger than steel, with a surface that seemed to shift between different metallic colors depending on the angle of the sunlight. The largest pieces of wreckage showed evidence of sophisticated construction, seamless joints, precise curves, and a level of engineering that exceeded anything available in 1897. But the most shocking discovery was not the wreckage itself. Among the debris, the residents of Aurora found the remains of the craft's pilot. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, including Ezekiel's detailed journal entry, the pilot was clearly not human. The being was described as being much smaller than an average person, perhaps 4 feet in height, with an oversized head and large dark eyes. The skin had a grayish color, and the limbs were thin and elongated compared to human proportions. Dr. Hiram Parks, Aurora's town physician, examined the remains and concluded that while the being was obviously intelligent and humanoid, it was definitely not of terrestrial origin. Several residents noted that the being wore clothing made from the same unidentifiable metallic material as the craft's construction, suggesting an advanced understanding of material science. The townspeople also discovered what appeared to be some kind of written language among the wreckage. Etched into several pieces of the metallic debris were symbols and characters that bore no resemblance to any earthly alphabet. Judge Proctor, who was reasonably well educated for the time and familiar with several European languages, could make no sense of the strange markings. Word of the crash spread quickly through the community, and within hours, people from neighboring towns began arriving to witness the extraordinary scene. The general consensus among the witnesses was that they had discovered the wreckage of some kind of airship, though the technology displayed was far beyond anything that existed in 1897. The Wright brothers would not achieve their first powered flight for another 6 years, yet here was evidence of a flying machine with capabilities that seemed almost magical. The town's Baptist minister, Reverend Charlie Stevens, raised concerns about the proper handling of the pilot's remains. Despite the being's obviously non-human characteristics, Reverend Stevens insisted that it deserved a Christian burial. The community agreed, and they conducted a funeral service for the unknown pilot on the afternoon of April 18, 1897. The burial took place in the Aurora Cemetery, in a small plot near the back of the graveyard. A simple wooden marker was placed over the grave, though the townspeople were uncertain what inscription would be appropriate. Eventually, they decided to carve symbols that resembled some of the strange markings found among the wreckage, hoping that these might serve as an appropriate memorial for a being from another world. As for the wreckage itself, the people of Aurora faced a difficult decision. The metallic debris was clearly valuable, both for its unusual properties and as evidence of an extraordinary event. However, the town was also concerned about attracting unwanted attention from government authorities or curiosity seekers who might disrupt their peaceful community. After considerable discussion, the townspeople decided to dispose of most of the wreckage in the town well. This may seem like a strange decision today, but in 1897, the well represented a convenient and secure location for hiding unusual materials. The well was deep, easily accessible, and could be sealed if necessary to prevent unauthorized access to its contents. According to Ezekiel's journal, several residents kept small pieces of the wreckage as souvenirs, though most of these artifacts disappeared over the years as family members moved away or lost interest in preserving the unusual materials. My great-great-grandfather was one of the few who maintained detailed records of the event and preserved some physical evidence. The story might have remained local folklore if not for a reporter named S.E. Hayden, who worked for the Dallas Morning News. Hayden arrived in Aurora several days after the crash and interviewed numerous witnesses, including Judge Proctor, Dr. Parks, and my great-great-grandfather. His article, published on April 19, 1897, brought national attention to the Aurora incident, though many readers assumed it was either a hoax or a misunderstanding of some conventional event. Hayden's article described the crash in terms that the 1897 audience could understand, referring to the craft as an airship and suggesting it might have been some kind of experimental flying machine. However, his account also included details that clearly indicated this was no conventional aircraft. The advanced materials, the non-human pilot, and the sophisticated construction techniques that exceeded anything available at the time. Over the following decades, the Aurora incident gradually faded from public attention. The town's population declined as the railroad moved its operations elsewhere, and many of the original witnesses passed away without leaving detailed records of their experiences. By the 1950s, most people outside of Aurora had forgotten about the 1897 crash entirely. However, the story experienced a resurgence of interest during the 1960s UFO wave, when researchers like Jim Mars began investigating historical accounts of unexplained aerial phenomena. Mars interviewed elderly Aurora residents who remembered hearing first-hand accounts of the crash from family members who had witnessed it. These interviews confirmed many of the details from Hayden's original newspaper article and provided additional information that had not been previously published. The renewed interest in the Aurora incident led to several attempts to locate physical evidence of the crash. In the 1970s, researchers used metal detectors to search Judge Proctor's former property, now owned by other families. They discovered numerous metallic fragments buried in the soil, some of which displayed unusual properties when analyzed by metallurgists. One particularly intriguing piece of evidence was a fragment that appeared to be made of an iron-aluminum alloy that should not have been possible to create with 1897 technology. The metallurgy required to produce such an alloy was not developed until the mid-20th century. Yet this fragment was found in soil layers that could be dated to the 1890s. Attempts were also made to locate the pilot's grave in the Aurora Cemetery, though these efforts were complicated by the fact that many of the original grave markers had deteriorated or been replaced over the years. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s identified several unmarked graves in the area where townspeople remembered the burial taking place, but cemetery officials refused to permit excavation of these sites. Perhaps the most compelling evidence came from the town well, where the wreckage had allegedly been disposed. When researchers obtained permission to examine the well in the 1980s, they found that it had been filled in with concrete sometime during the 1940s. Local residents recalled that this had been done after several people became ill with what they described as metal sickness after drinking from the well. Water samples taken from nearby wells showed unusual mineral concentrations that could not be explained by the local geology. Spectrographic analysis revealed trace elements that were extremely rare in terrestrial environments, suggesting that some kind of exotic material might indeed have contaminated the local water supply. My own involvement in preserving this story began when I inherited Ezekiel's journal and a small collection of artifacts that had been passed down through our family. Among these artifacts were 3 small pieces of metallic debris that Ezekiel had kept as evidence of the crash. These fragments display properties that continue to baffle materials scientists who have examined them. The metal appears to have a memory characteristic. When bent or deformed, it slowly returns to its original shape over the course of several hours. The surface shows no signs of oxidation or corrosion despite being over 125 years old. Most remarkably, the metal seems to generate a very weak electrical current when exposed to sunlight, suggesting some kind of photovoltaic properties that were unknown in 1897. I have shared these artifacts with several universities and research institutions over the years, always with the stipulation that they be returned to my family's custody. The analysis results have been consistently puzzling. The metal contains isotope ratios that are not typical of terrestrial materials, and the manufacturing techniques required to create such precise atomic structures exceed our current technological capabilities. The Aurora incident represents more than just a historical curiosity for my family and our community. It suggests that contact between humans and extraterrestrial intelligence may have occurred much earlier than most people realize. The 1897 date places this event decades before the beginning of the modern UFO era, yet the witness accounts and physical evidence are remarkably consistent with contemporary reports of UFO crashes and alien encounters. What makes the Aurora case particularly compelling is the number of credible witnesses who documented the event. These were not sensation seekers or UFO enthusiasts. They were ordinary citizens of a small Texas town who found themselves confronted with something extraordinary and did their best to record and preserve the evidence. Judge Proctor was a respected member of the community with no reason to fabricate such a story. Dr. Parks was a medical professional whose reputation depended on his credibility and judgment. Reverend Stevens was a man of the cloth who took his spiritual responsibilities seriously. These were not people prone to flights of fancy or deliberate deception. The Aurora incident also demonstrates the challenges faced by small communities when confronted with phenomena that exceed their understanding. The townspeople handled the situation with remarkable dignity and thoughtfulness, ensuring that the pilot received a proper burial and attempting to preserve evidence of the event for future generations. Today, Aurora remains a small farming community, much quieter than it was during its railroad boom years. The population has dwindled to fewer than 1,500 residents, and many of the buildings from the 1890s have been replaced or renovated beyond recognition. But the cemetery still exists, and somewhere among those weathered headstones lies the grave of a being from another world who found his final resting place in the Texas soil. I continue to serve as the unofficial keeper of our family's Aurora incident records, sharing the story with researchers and historians who express genuine interest in learning about this remarkable event. Whether people choose to believe the account is less important to me than ensuring that the story is preserved accurately for future generations. The truth about what happened in Aurora on that April morning in 1897 may never be fully understood, but the evidence suggests that our small Texas town was the site of one of the most significant events in human history, our first documented contact with visitors from beyond our world. My name is Donald Schrum, and I am a welder and part-time hunting guide from Auburn, California. What I am about to tell you happened during a bow hunting trip in September of 1964 in the remote forest near Cisco Grove in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I've shared this story with very few people over the years because I know how unbelievable it sounds. But what I experienced during that terrifying night in the wilderness was as real as anything I have ever encountered in my 60-plus years of life. I had driven up to the Cisco Grove area with two friends, Tim Trueblood and Vincent Alvarez, for what was supposed to be a routine weekend bow hunting trip. We had been hunting together for several years, and this particular area had always been productive for deer and elk. The plan was simple. We would hike into the backcountry on Friday evening, set up a base camp, and then spread out to hunt individually on Saturday morning. Cisco Grove sits at about 5,000 feet elevation in the Tahoe National Forest, an area of dense pine and fir trees, broken by granite outcroppings and small meadows. The terrain is challenging but beautiful, with clear streams, mountain views, and abundant wildlife. We had hunted this region many times before and were familiar with the landmarks and general layout of the area. On Friday afternoon, we hiked about 3 miles from our parked truck to establish our base camp near a small creek. The weather was perfect for September. Clear skies, cool temperatures, and no wind to speak of. After setting up our tents and organizing our gear, we spent the evening around a campfire, planning our hunting strategy for the next day and enjoying the peaceful mountain environment. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. We ate a quick breakfast and agreed to meet back at camp before dark, regardless of whether we had been successful in our hunting. Tim headed north toward a ridge where we had seen deer sign on previous trips. Vince went east toward a series of meadows where elk sometimes grazed in the early morning. I decided to hunt alone in the southern area, where the terrain was more rugged, but where I had taken a nice buck the previous year. The morning hunt was unsuccessful for all of us. I saw some deer tracks and a few squirrels, but nothing worth taking a shot at. By mid-afternoon, I was several miles from our base camp, working my way along a steep hillside covered with dense manzanita brush and scattered pine trees. The area was beautiful, but challenging to navigate, with loose rock and thick undergrowth that made quiet movement difficult. Around 4 o'clock, I realized that I had become disoriented. The dense forest and similar-looking terrain had confused my sense of direction, and I was no longer certain which way led back to our camp. I climbed to a high point to get my bearings, but the thick tree canopy blocked most distant landmarks. Worse, a heavy fog was beginning to roll in from the west, reducing visibility and making navigation even more difficult. I was not particularly worried at this point. I had plenty of experience in the wilderness, and I carried basic survival gear, including matches, a flashlight, and emergency food. My plan was to find a safe, defensible position for the night, and then work my way back to camp in the morning when the fog cleared, and I could see the surrounding landmarks. I found what seemed like an ideal spot, a large oak tree growing on a granite slope, with good visibility in all directions and access to fresh water from a small spring about 50 yards away. The tree had strong, well-spaced branches that would allow me to construct a comfortable sleeping platform well above ground level, safe from any predators that might be in the area. Using my bowstring and some paracord I carried for emergencies, I lashed together a crude but stable platform about 12 feet above the ground. I gathered pine boughs to create insulation and padding, and settled in to wait for morning. The fog continued to thicken as darkness approached, but I felt secure in my elevated position. That security did not last long. Around 10 o'clock, I heard movement in the forest below my tree. At first, I assumed it was deer or elk passing through the area, but as I listened more carefully, I realized that whatever was moving down there was doing so with purpose and intelligence. There was a pattern to the sounds, systematic searching rather than the random movement of grazing animals. I quietly retrieved my flashlight and aimed it toward the sounds. What I saw in the beam made my blood run cold. 3 figures were moving through the forest, but they were not human. They stood approximately 5.5 feet tall with dark, hairy bodies that reminded me of descriptions I had heard of Bigfoot. But their behavior was completely unlike any animal I had ever encountered. The creatures moved with obvious intelligence, communicating with each other through a series of hand gestures and soft vocalizations. They carried what appeared to be some kind of equipment, metallic objects that caught the reflection of my flashlight beam. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be searching for something specific, moving in a coordinated pattern that suggested they were following a plan. Then one of them looked up and spotted me in the tree. The creature pointed in my direction and made a series of sounds to its companions. All 3 beings moved to positions around the base of my oak tree and began what I can only describe as a siege. They did not attempt to climb the tree immediately, but rather seemed content to wait me out. Over the next several hours, the creatures took turns maintaining watch, while the others disappeared into the forest, presumably to retrieve additional equipment, or perhaps more of their kind. During these periods of waiting, I got a good look at the beings through my flashlight beam. They appeared to be covered in dark, coarse hair, with large eyes that reflected light like those of nocturnal animals. Their hands were more human-like than ape-like, with long, dexterous fingers capable of manipulating tools. Around midnight, the creatures began their assault on my position. They started by throwing rocks and sticks at me, forcing me to take cover behind the main trunk of the tree. When this did not dislodge me, they began attempting to climb the oak tree itself. Their climbing ability was impressive but not perfect. The tree was large enough, and the branches spaced widely enough that I could prevent them from reaching my platform by knocking them off with my bow. The situation became truly terrifying when one of the creatures produced what I can only describe as a device that emitted some kind of gas or vapor. The being aimed this device upward toward my position, and within seconds, I was engulfed in a cloud of white, sweet-smelling gas. The vapors made me dizzy and nauseous, and I realized that they were attempting to incapacitate me with some kind of chemical weapon. I had matches and dry tinder with me, so I quickly built a small fire on my platform to create an updraft that would disperse the gas. The smoke from my fire seemed to discourage the creatures temporarily, but they soon adapted their tactics. One of them began shining an intensely bright light upward from the base of the tree, a light that was much more powerful than any flashlight I had ever seen. The light was so brilliant that it was painful to look at directly, but in its illumination, I could see something that terrified me even more than the hairy creatures. Hovering silently in the fog above the treetops was some kind of craft. It was difficult to make out details through the mist, but the object appeared to be disc-shaped and was clearly under intelligent control. As the night progressed, more creatures arrived, until I counted at least 6 beings surrounding my tree. They worked in coordinated teams, taking turns attempting to climb up to my position while others provided support from the ground. Several times, creatures managed to reach branches only a few feet below my platform before I was able to drive them back with burning sticks from my fire. The beings also deployed additional equipment during the siege. Besides the gas-emitting device and the powerful light, they produced what appeared to be some kind of net or webbing material. They attempted to throw this over my platform to entangle me, but the irregular shape of the tree branches prevented them from getting a clear shot at my position. The most frightening part of the ordeal was the intelligence and coordination displayed by these creatures. They clearly had a plan for capturing me, and they adapted their tactics when initial approaches failed. They communicated constantly with each other through gestures and vocalizations, and they showed remarkable persistence in their efforts. Throughout the night, I maintained my fire as much as possible, both for protection from the gas attacks and as a weapon to drive back climbing creatures. I also used my bow to shoot arrows at the beings, though the darkness and fog made accurate shots difficult. Several of my arrows did strike their targets, but the creatures showed no signs of serious injury and continued their assault. By dawn, I had been under siege for nearly 8 hours. My fire had consumed most of the available fuel on my platform. My arrows were exhausted, and I was becoming weak from the stress and exposure to the gas attacks. The creatures seemed to sense that I was weakening, and they intensified their efforts to reach my position. Just as I was beginning to despair, I heard a new sound in the distance, the noise of aircraft engines. Within minutes, a military helicopter appeared through the fog, flying low over the forest canopy. The sound of the helicopter seemed to alarm the creatures, and they quickly retreated into the dense undergrowth. The hovering craft above the trees also disappeared, moving away silently through the fog. The helicopter did not land, but its presence apparently discouraged my attackers from continuing their siege. After the aircraft passed, the forest remained quiet for the first time in 8 hours. I waited in my tree for another hour to make certain the creatures had truly departed before climbing down from my platform. Once on the ground, I found abundant evidence of the night's events. The area around the oak tree was trampled with footprints unlike any I had ever seen. Larger than human prints, but with a different toe configuration than any known animal. I also found several pieces of metallic debris that appeared to be fragments from the equipment the creatures had been using. I made my way back to our base camp by late morning, where Tim and Vince were preparing to organize a search for me. They could see immediately that I had been through some kind of ordeal. My clothes were torn and burned. I was covered with scratches and burns from defending my position, and I was clearly exhausted and shaken by the experience. When I told them what had happened, their initial reaction was skepticism. The story was so incredible that I understood their doubts. However, when we returned to the site together, the physical evidence was undeniable. The footprints, the metallic fragments, the burned areas where I had maintained my fire, Everything supported my account of the night's events. We reported the incident to the local sheriff's department, though I was careful to downplay some of the more extraordinary aspects of the encounter. I described it as an attack by unknown creatures, without mentioning the hovering craft or the advanced equipment they had used. Even with this edited version of events, the deputies seemed skeptical and suggested that I might have encountered a family of bears. Over the years since the Cisco Grove incident, I have researched similar encounters and discovered that my experience, while unusual, was not unique. Other people have reported encounters with hairy, humanoid creatures that displayed intelligence and tool use far beyond any known animal species. The coordination between these ground-based creatures and aerial phenomena has also been reported in other cases. I have shared the complete story with researchers from several UFO investigation organizations, and they have found my account credible and consistent with other reports from the same geographic region. The Sierra Nevada mountains seem to be an area of frequent, unusual activity, possibly because the remote forested terrain provides cover for phenomena that prefer to avoid human observation. The metallic fragments I recovered from the site were analyzed by a materials laboratory, but the results were inconclusive. The metal showed unusual properties, but nothing that definitively proved extraterrestrial origin. The footprint casts we made have been examined by wildlife experts, but no positive identification of the creatures has been made. The Cisco Grove incident remains the most significant event of my life, an encounter that changed my understanding of what might exist in the wilderness areas of our planet. I continue to hunt and spend time in the mountains, but I'm much more careful about venturing into remote areas alone, and I always carry additional emergency equipment in case I encounter something beyond ordinary human experience. My name is Shelby Grant, and I work as a wilderness therapy coordinator for troubled teens based out of Asheville, North Carolina. My partner in both life and work is Marcus Green, a former park ranger who now helps me guide young people through challenging outdoor experiences in the Blue Ridge Mountains. What I am about to share happened during a backpacking trip in October of 2018, when Marcus and I were scouting new trail routes in a particularly remote section of the Appalachian Trail near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. We had been working together for 3 years at that point, combining my background in social work with Marcus's extensive knowledge of wilderness survival and trail navigation. Our program takes small groups of teenagers who are struggling with behavioral issues, addiction problems, or family trauma on multi-day hiking expeditions designed to build confidence, responsibility, and emotional resilience. The work is demanding but incredibly rewarding, and it requires us to constantly explore new areas where we can safely challenge our participants without exposing them to unnecessary risks. The section of the Appalachian Trail we were investigating runs through some of the most remote and beautiful country in the southern Appalachians. This particular area, located about 15 miles north of Hot Springs, North Carolina, features dense hardwood forests, cascading streams, and panoramic views from high ridges that stretch for dozens of miles in every direction. In early October, the fall foliage was at its peak, creating a spectacular display of reds, yellows, and oranges that seemed to set the entire mountainside on fire. We had started our scouting expedition on a Tuesday morning, planning to spend 3 days and 2 nights evaluating potential campsites, water sources, and trail conditions for future trips with our teen groups. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, and no precipitation expected for the rest of the week. We carried lightweight backpacking gear and enough food for our planned itinerary, plus an extra day's worth of supplies in case we decided to extend our exploration. The first day of hiking went exactly as planned. We covered about 12 miles of trail, stopping frequently to GPS potential camping areas and to photograph landmarks that would help us navigate future groups through the region. The trail was well maintained, The water sources were reliable, and we identified several excellent camping spots that would work well for groups of 8 to 10 teenagers. That evening, we set up our tent on a narrow ridge about 4,000 feet in elevation, with commanding views both east and west across the folded mountain landscape. The sunset was spectacular, painting the distant peaks in shades of purple and gold, while the valleys filled with soft blue shadows. We cooked a simple dinner on our camp stove, reviewed our notes from the day's hike, and planned our route for the following morning. As darkness settled over the mountains, we noticed an unusual weather phenomenon developing in the valley below our campsite. A thick blue-tinted mist was rising from the lower elevations, much denser and more distinctly colored than the normal fog we typically see in the Appalachians during autumn evenings. The mist had an almost luminescent quality, as if it were being illuminated from within by some invisible light source. Marcus pointed out that the mist was behaving strangely. Instead of drifting randomly with the mountain breezes, it seemed to be moving with purpose and direction, flowing uphill through the valleys in streams and tendrils that defied the normal patterns of air circulation. The blue coloration was also unusual. Mountain mist is typically white or gray, but this fog had a distinct azure tint that made it clearly visible even in the darkness. We watched this phenomenon for about 30 minutes, fascinated by its unusual appearance and movement. As experienced outdoors people, we had seen countless examples of mountain weather, but neither of us had ever observed mist that behaved in such a purposeful, almost intelligent manner. The fog continued to rise through the valleys, gradually reaching higher elevations and approaching our ridgetop position. Around 10:30, just as we were preparing to retire to our tent for the night, we noticed lights moving within the mist. At first, they appeared to be small, isolated points of illumination, but as they drew closer, we could see that they were actually larger objects that emitted a soft, steady glow. The lights moved smoothly through the fog, following its contours and streams as it flowed up the mountainsides. Marcus grabbed his binoculars and tried to get a closer look at the approaching lights. What he described to me was unlike anything either of us had ever seen. The lights appeared to be spherical objects, roughly the size of basketballs, that glowed with the same blue luminescence as the mist itself. They moved independently of each other, but in a coordinated fashion, as if they were following predetermined routes or responding to some kind of guidance system. As we watched in growing amazement, the mist and its accompanying lights reached our elevation and began to surround our campsite. The fog was much thicker than it had appeared from a distance, reducing our visibility to perhaps 20 feet in any direction. The temperature dropped noticeably as we were enveloped by the mist, and we both noticed a strange tingling sensation in the air, similar to the feeling you get just before a lightning strike. The spherical lights continued to move through the fog around our position, sometimes passing so close that we could have reached out and touched them. Up close, we could see that they were not solid objects, but rather contained some kind of swirling, plasma-like energy that created fascinating patterns of light and shadow. They emitted no sound whatsoever and seemed to float effortlessly through the air without any visible means of propulsion. Marcus attempted to photograph the phenomenon with his digital camera, but every time he tried to take a picture, the camera malfunctioned. The LCD screen would flicker and go dark, and the camera would shut down completely. My GPS unit also stopped functioning properly. The screen showed our location as being somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which was obviously impossible. After perhaps 20 minutes of being surrounded by the mist and lights, we experienced something that still gives me chills when I think about it. One of the spherical objects descended from above and hovered directly over our tent, perhaps 10 feet above the fabric roof. The blue glow intensified dramatically, and suddenly the surface of the sphere became transparent, revealing a complex internal structure that defied description. Inside the sphere, We could see what appeared to be geometric patterns of light that moved and shifted in three-dimensional space. The patterns were incredibly intricate, like mathematical equations or architectural blueprints rendered in pure energy. As we watched, mesmerized, these light patterns began to project themselves downward, creating a cone of illumination that surrounded our entire campsite. Within this cone of light, we began to see images that seemed to be projected directly onto the mist itself. The images showed aerial views of the Appalachian Mountains, but from perspectives and elevations that would be impossible to achieve with conventional aircraft. We could see the entire mountain range spread out like a relief map, with incredible detail and clarity that revealed features we had never noticed from ground level. The images shifted and changed, showing different seasons and different times of day. We saw the mountains covered in snow, brilliant with spring wildflowers, lush with summer vegetation, and painted with autumn colors. But we also saw views that seemed to come from different time periods, forests that looked more pristine and extensive than anything that exists today, and what appeared to be indigenous settlements and valleys that are now empty wilderness. Most remarkably, the projections seemed to be interactive. When Marcus pointed toward a particular ridge visible in one of the images, the view would zoom in to show that area in greater detail. When I focused my attention on a specific valley, the projection would provide multiple perspectives of that location, as if responding to our thoughts and interests. This incredible display continued for perhaps an hour, during which we felt no fear or anxiety despite the otherworldly nature of what we were experiencing. Instead, we both described feeling a profound sense of peace and connection, as if we were being welcomed as temporary guests in some vast, ancient intelligence that had been observing these mountains for countless centuries. The phenomena began to fade as gradually as they had appeared. The projected images slowly dissolved. The sphere above our tent became opaque again and drifted away, and the surrounding lights retreated back into the mist. The fog itself began to thin and dissipate, revealing the star-filled sky and the familiar silhouettes of the surrounding peaks. By midnight, the mountains had returned to their normal appearance, and our electronic devices began functioning properly again. Marcus's camera showed no record of the time period during which it had malfunctioned. There was simply a gap in the timestamp sequence where the photos should have been. My GPS unit showed our correct location once again, with no explanation for its earlier malfunction. We spent the rest of the night discussing what we had witnessed, trying to make sense of an experience that challenged every assumption we had about the nature of reality. As wilderness professionals with decades of combined experience in the outdoors, we had both developed a healthy skepticism about unexplained phenomena. But what we had witnessed was so far beyond normal experience that conventional explanations seemed inadequate. The next morning, we conducted a careful examination of our campsite and the surrounding area, looking for any physical evidence of the previous night's events. We found no burn marks, no unusual debris, no electromagnetic anomalies that we could detect with our basic equipment. The only unusual feature was that the vegetation immediately around our tent appeared to be healthier and more vibrant than the surrounding forest, as if it had been somehow energized or revitalized. We completed our scouting mission over the following day, but our focus had shifted from evaluating potential camping sites to trying to understand what we had experienced. We interviewed several local residents in Hot Springs, asking carefully worded questions about unusual phenomena in the mountains. While most people were reluctant to discuss such matters with strangers, we did learn that the area has a long history of unexplained lights and unusual mist formations. One elderly man, a retired park ranger named Thomas Caldwell, told us that indigenous peoples had considered this particular section of the mountains to be sacred, believing it to be a place where the spirits of the land could be directly encountered. He said that Park Service personnel had received numerous reports over the years of unusual lights and mist formations in the area, but these reports were typically dismissed as atmospheric phenomena or misidentified aircraft. Thomas also mentioned that the area had been the site of several unexplained disappearances over the decades, hikers who had vanished without a trace despite extensive search efforts. However, he emphasized that these disappearances were rare and that the mountains were generally safe for experienced hikers who followed proper safety protocols. Our experience has profoundly affected both our personal relationship and our professional approach to wilderness therapy. We have returned to the same area several times since that October night, hoping to witness similar phenomena, but we have never again encountered the blue mist and its mysterious lights. However, we have noticed that the area seems to have an unusual effect on the teenagers we bring there. They consistently report feeling more peaceful and connected to nature in that location than in other areas we visit. We have shared our story with a few trusted colleagues and friends, but we have been careful in not to publicize the specific location or include it in our regular programming routes. The experience felt deeply sacred and personal, and we worry that commercializing it or attracting crowds of curiosity seekers might somehow diminish or destroy whatever intelligence we encountered that night. Marcus and I have both become more open to possibilities that extend beyond conventional scientific understanding. Our work with troubled teenagers has always involved helping them discover their connection to something larger than themselves, whether that be nature, community, or spiritual tradition. Our encounter in the Appalachian Mountains reinforced our belief that the natural world contains mysteries and intelligences that we are only beginning to understand. The blue mist and its lights remain the most extraordinary experience of our lives, a reminder that even in our modern technological age, there are still phenomena that cannot be easily explained or categorized. Whether what we encountered was extraterrestrial intelligence, some kind of natural plasma phenomenon, or something else entirely, it expanded our understanding of what might be possible in this vast and mysterious universe. Sometimes, on clear autumn evenings when we are camping in the mountains with our teenage groups, Marcus and I find ourselves watching the valleys for signs of that distinctive blue mist. We have never seen it again, but the memory of that extraordinary night continues to inspire our work and deepen our appreciation for the profound mysteries that surround us in the wilderness. The Appalachian Mountains have been home to countless generations of human beings, from indigenous peoples to modern hikers and campers. Our brief encounter with whatever intelligence inhabits that blue mist reminded us that we are not alone in these ancient mountains, and that the natural world contains depths of mystery and beauty that we may never fully comprehend. My name is Harold Dahl, and I work as a harbor patrol officer for the Tacoma Harbor Department in Washington State. What I am about to share happened in June of 1947, just 3 days before the famous Kenneth Arnold flying saucer sighting that made headlines across the country. My experience on Maury Island represents one of the earliest documented encounters with both unidentified flying objects and the mysterious individuals who have come to be known as Men in Black. I'd been working harbor patrol for about 8 years by 1947, and my duties included monitoring boat traffic, checking fishing licenses, and conducting safety inspections of vessels operating in the Puget Sound area. It was steady, honest work that allowed me to spend my days on the water in some of the most beautiful scenery in the Pacific Northwest. My 15-year-old son Charles often accompanied me during school holidays and summer vacation, helping with routine tasks and learning about marine safety and navigation. On the morning of June 21st, 1947, Charles and I set out from the Tacoma Harbor in our patrol boat for a routine inspection cruise around the southern end of Vashon Island. The weather was clear but overcast, typical for June in western Washington, with calm seas and light winds from the southwest. We planned to spend the day checking on several fishing boats that had been operating in the area, and investigating reports of debris washing up on some of the smaller islands. Our first stop was Maury Island, a small, heavily forested island connected to Vashon Island by a narrow strip of land. Maury Island was mostly uninhabited, except for a few summer cabins, and it served as a popular destination for recreational boaters and weekend campers. We were investigating reports that someone had been dumping garbage or industrial waste in the waters around the island, potentially creating a navigation hazard for other vessels. As we approached the eastern shore of Maury Island around 11 o'clock in the morning, we noticed something unusual in the sky above us. 6 objects that appeared to be metallic discs were flying in a tight formation about 2,000 feet overhead. At first, I thought they might be some kind of experimental military aircraft. The Navy had a significant presence in the Puget Sound area, and we occasionally saw unusual planes conducting training exercises. But as we watched these objects more closely, it became clear that they were unlike any aircraft either Charles or I had ever seen. The discs were perfectly round, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with highly reflective metallic surfaces that caught and amplified the filtered sunlight coming through the overcast sky. They moved in perfect synchronization, maintaining their formation while executing turns and maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of aerodynamics. Most remarkably, the objects were completely silent. Even from our position on the water, 2,000 feet below, we should have been able to hear engine noise from conventional aircraft. These discs moved through the air without producing any sound whatsoever, which seemed impossible given their size and obvious speed. As Charles and I continued to observe this extraordinary sight, one of the objects began to separate from the formation. This disc appeared to be in some kind of distress. It wobbled erratically, lost altitude, and began emitting a dark substance that fell toward the water like rain. The other 5 objects maintained their formation above the struggling disc, as if they were monitoring its condition or attempting to provide assistance. The material being discharged from the malfunctioning disc fell directly into the waters around our boat. As these substances hit the surface, we could see that they consisted of 2 different types of debris. Most of the falling material appeared to be a light metallic slag that floated on the water's surface and glowed with a faint reddish light. Mixed with this floating material were heavier, darker chunks that sank immediately upon hitting the water. Some of this debris landed directly on our boat, and I was able to examine it closely. The lighter material had the consistency of aluminum foil, but was much more durable and seemed to generate its own heat. Even though it appeared thin and fragile, I could not tear or bend it with my hands. The heavier chunks looked like some kind of metallic rock, dark, extremely dense, and with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. After perhaps 10 minutes of this strange material rain, the struggling disc suddenly stabilized and rejoined its formation. All 6 objects then accelerated rapidly and disappeared to the northwest, moving so quickly that they vanished from sight within seconds. The entire encounter had lasted maybe 15 minutes, but Charles and I were left with a boat full of unusual debris and no rational explanation for what we had witnessed. We collected samples of both types of material and returned to Tacoma Harbor to report our observations. I filed a standard incident report with my supervisor, describing the unusual objects and the debris they had discharged. However, I was careful to keep my description factual and avoid speculation about the origin or nature of the objects. I simply reported that we had observed 6 unidentified aircraft conducting what appeared to be some kind of training exercise over Maury Island. My supervisor was skeptical, but not dismissive. He suggested that we might have witnessed a classified military operation and advised me to store the debris samples securely until we could determine the appropriate authorities to contact. He also asked me to keep the incident confidential pending further investigation, which I agreed to do. That evening, I received a telephone call at home from a man who identified himself as a representative of a government agency. He did not specify which agency he represented, but he spoke with authority and seemed to have detailed knowledge of our encounter at Maury Island. He asked me to meet with him the following morning to discuss what Charles and I had observed. The meeting was arranged for 8 o'clock the next morning at a small diner on the outskirts of Tacoma. When I arrived, I found a man sitting alone in a corner booth, wearing a dark business suit and a black fedora hat. He appeared to be in his 40s, with pale skin, dark hair, and unusually intense eyes. His manner was polite, but somehow unsettling. He seemed to know things about me and my family that I had not shared with anyone. The man never provided his name or showed any identification, but he spoke with complete confidence about the events at Maury Island. He described our encounter in precise detail, including information that I had not included in my official report. He knew about the formation of 6 discs, the debris discharge, and even the specific types of material we had collected. His message was clear and direct. The objects we had observed were part of a classified government program that required absolute secrecy. Our continued silence about the incident was essential to national security. He strongly advised me to dispose of the debris samples and to discourage Charles from discussing what we had seen with anyone, including other family members. The man's tone was not exactly threatening, but there was an unmistakable implication that failure to comply with his instructions would have serious consequences. He mentioned that he was aware of my employment with the Harbor Patrol, my family's address, and Charles's school schedule. The message was clear. Our cooperation was expected, and our activities were being monitored. After delivering this warning, the man simply stood up and walked out of the diner. I never saw him again, but his visit had a profound impact on both my behavior and my understanding of what we had witnessed at Maury Island. It was clear that our encounter involved something much more significant than a routine military exercise. Over the following days, I found myself under subtle but persistent surveillance. I would notice the same dark sedan parked on different streets near my house or workplace. When I went fishing or boating in my personal time, I would occasionally spot boats that seemed to be following me at a distance. Phone calls to my home would sometimes be interrupted by clicking sounds or brief periods of silence that suggested our line was being monitored. Charles also reported strange experiences at school. He said that a man in a dark suit had approached him during lunch and asked him questions about our trip to Maury Island. The man claimed to be conducting a survey about maritime safety, but his questions focused specifically on what Charles had seen in the sky that day. My son was smart enough to give vague, non-committal answers, but the encounter clearly disturbed him. The surveillance and intimidation continued for several months after our Maury Island experience. I disposed of the debris samples as instructed, though I kept small pieces hidden in my home as insurance against future threats. I also wrote a detailed account of our encounter and gave copies to trusted friends with instructions to make the information public if anything happened to me or my family. The pressure to remain silent became even more intense after the Kenneth Arnold sighting near Mount Rainier on June 24th, just 3 days after our encounter. Arnold's story received massive media attention and sparked a nationwide wave of UFO reports. Suddenly, flying saucers were front-page news, and government officials were making public statements about the need to investigate these phenomena. In this environment, I decided to quietly share my story with a few UFO researchers who were documenting similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. I was careful to provide only basic details and to emphasize that I could not provide physical evidence or submit to extensive interviews. However, I felt that my account might help establish a pattern of activity that could lead to better understanding of these phenomena. The researchers I contacted were fascinated by the Maury Island case, particularly because it preceded the Arnold sighting by several days. They pointed out that our encounter involved multiple objects, physical debris, and subsequent government contact, elements that made it one of the most significant early UFO cases on record. They also noted that the intimidation tactics we experienced were among the first documented examples of what would later become known as Men in Black encounters. Over the years, since 1947, I have followed UFO research and investigation with great interest, though always from a distance. I have been struck by how many other witnesses have reported encounters with mysterious government agents who discourage them from discussing their UFO experiences. The pattern of behavior, the dark suits, the detailed knowledge of private information, the subtle threats, has remained remarkably consistent across decades and geographic locations. I have also been amazed by advances in our understanding of the physical properties of the debris we collected at Maury Island. When I eventually had small samples analyzed by independent laboratories in the 1960s, the results showed unusual isotope ratios and metallic compositions that could not be explained by conventional material science. The lighter material showed properties similar to what researchers now call memory metal, materials that can be deformed but return to their original shape when heated or subjected to electrical current. The Maury Island incident remains one of the earliest and most thoroughly documented UFO encounters in American history. What makes it particularly significant is not just the quality of the sighting itself, but the immediate government response and the intimidation tactics used to suppress information about the event. The men in black who contacted me demonstrated knowledge and resources that suggested a well-organized effort to monitor and control public access to UFO information. Charles is now in his 80s, and we still occasionally discuss our experience at Maury Island. We both remain convinced that what we witnessed was not of terrestrial origin, and that the government response indicated official knowledge of extraterrestrial visitation. The surveillance and intimidation we experienced confirmed that there are powerful forces working to prevent public disclosure of these encounters. The Maury Island case represents more than just an isolated UFO sighting. It provides early evidence of a systematic effort to suppress information about extraterrestrial contact, an effort that may have been ongoing for decades before the modern UFO era began. Our encounter with the men in black suggests that government awareness of these phenomena extends far beyond what has ever been publicly acknowledged. Today, nearly 8 decades after our encounter at Maury Island, the questions raised by our experience remain unanswered. Who were the beings operating those metallic discs? What was the purpose of their mission over Puget Sound? And perhaps most importantly, what does the government really know about extraterrestrial visitation? And why have they worked so hard to keep that information secret? The debris may be gone, and the men in black may have succeeded in silencing most witnesses. But the truth about what happened at Maury Island in 1947 cannot be permanently suppressed. Someday, the full story of humanity's contact with extraterrestrial intelligence will be revealed, and the Maury Island incident will be recognized as one of the earliest chapters in that extraordinary history. My name is Lonnie Zamora, and I served as a police officer with the Socorro Police Department in New Mexico for over 20 years. What I witnessed on the afternoon of April 24th, 1964, changed my life forever and remains one of the most thoroughly investigated UFO cases in American history. I have told this story countless times to investigators, reporters, and government officials. Despite the skepticism I have encountered over the years, I stand by every detail of what I experienced that day. I was on routine patrol duty that Friday afternoon, driving south on Highway 85 toward the edge of Socorro around 5:45 in the evening. It had been a quiet day, a few traffic stops, one minor fender bender, and the usual paperwork that comes with small-town police work. Socorro was a peaceful community of about 6,000 people, nestled in the high desert of central New Mexico, where the most serious crimes were typically burglary or domestic disputes. I was approaching the intersection near the college when I heard a loud, roaring sound, like a jet engine at full throttle. Looking around, I could see no aircraft in the immediate area, but the sound seemed to be coming from the southwest, in the direction of the dynamite shack operated by the local mining company. My first thought was that there might have been an explosion at the facility. Accidental detonations were not unheard of in our area. I radioed the dispatcher to report that I was investigating a possible explosion and turned my patrol car off the highway onto a rough dirt road that led toward the dynamite shack. The terrain in that area was typical of the New Mexico high desert. Scattered juniper and pinyon pine trees, rocky arroyos, and gently rolling hills covered with sparse desert vegetation. The dirt road was rough and rutted, forcing me to drive slowly to avoid damaging my vehicle. As I crested a small hill about a quarter mile from the highway, I spotted something unusual in a shallow arroyo, perhaps 150 yards ahead of my position. At first glance, it appeared to be a car that had somehow overturned in the gully, with two people in white coveralls standing nearby. My immediate assumption was that I had come across an automobile accident, and I prepared to provide assistance and call for medical support if needed. I drove closer to get a better view of the situation, but as I approached to within about 100 yards, I realized that what I was seeing was not an automobile accident. The object in the arroyo was unlike any vehicle I had ever encountered. It was egg-shaped or oval, roughly the size of a small car, with a bright metallic surface that reflected the late afternoon sunlight. There were no wheels, no doors, no windows, and no other features that would identify it as any kind of conventional vehicle. The two figures I had initially mistaken for accident victims were also clearly not human. They stood approximately 4 feet tall, with thin builds and proportionally large heads. They appeared to be wearing white, one-piece garments that covered their entire bodies, except for their heads and hands. From my distance, I could not make out facial features clearly, but I could see that they were moving around the object in a purposeful manner, as if conducting some kind of inspection or maintenance procedure. I stopped my patrol car and reached for my radio to report this extraordinary situation. However, as I began to transmit, one of the beings seemed to notice my presence. It turned in my direction and appeared to communicate something to its companion. Both figures then moved quickly toward the egg-shaped object and disappeared from my view. Suddenly, the object began to emit an intense roaring sound, much louder and more powerful than what I had heard initially from the highway. The noise was accompanied by bright blue and orange flames that shot downward from the bottom of the craft, creating clouds of dust and debris in the arroyo. The flames appeared to be some kind of propulsion system, but unlike any rocket or jet engine I had ever seen. The object rose slowly from the arroyo, continuing to emit the deafening roar and brilliant flames. As it gained altitude, I could see that it had no visible means of conventional propulsion. No propellers, no wings, no jet exhausts except for the flames beneath it. The craft climbed steadily to perhaps 20 feet above the ground. Then suddenly the flames disappeared, and the roaring sound stopped completely. In the sudden silence, the object continued to rise and began moving toward the southwest at increasing speed. Within seconds, it had climbed to perhaps 300 feet and was accelerating rapidly away from my position. I watched until it disappeared over the distant mountains, amazed by the speed and maneuverability it had demonstrated. I immediately drove down into the arroyo to examine the area where the object had been resting. What I found there provided compelling physical evidence that something extraordinary had occurred. The ground showed 4 distinct impressions arranged in a rectangular pattern, each about 3 feet long and 6 inches wide. These impressions appeared to have been created by landing pads or supports, and they were pressed into the hard-packed desert soil to a depth of several inches. More dramatic were the burn marks scattered throughout the area. The desert vegetation, primarily greasewood bushes and small cacti, showed clear evidence of exposure to intense heat. Many plants were charred or still smoldering, and the pattern of burning radiated outward from the center of the rectangular area marked by the landing impressions. The burned area covered roughly 40 feet in diameter, with the most intense damage concentrated directly beneath where I had seen the object hovering. I also found several small pieces of metallic debris scattered around the landing site. These fragments appeared to be extremely thin and lightweight, similar to aluminum foil, but with unusual properties. When I tried to bend or crease the material, it would spring back to its original shape. One piece had strange markings on it that resembled symbols or writing, but in no language or alphabet I could identify. I secured the area and radioed for backup, requesting that other officers respond to assist with the investigation. Sergeant Sam Chavez arrived within 10 minutes, followed shortly by State Police Officer Ted Jordan and Captain Richard Holder from the New Mexico State Police. All of these men were experienced law enforcement officers who treated the scene with appropriate seriousness and professionalism. The physical evidence was photographed and documented before any of us disturbed the site further. The landing impressions were measured and found to be precisely positioned, forming a perfect rectangle with each pad mark showing identical depth and shape. The burn patterns were mapped and samples of the charred vegetation were collected for analysis. The metallic fragments were carefully gathered and placed in evidence containers. Captain Holder contacted authorities at nearby White Sands Missile Range and Kirtland Air Force Base to determine whether any experimental aircraft or missile tests might explain what I had witnessed. Both facilities reported that no operations were being conducted in the Socorro area that afternoon, and that they had no aircraft or vehicles that matched the description of the object I had seen. The investigation quickly attracted attention from federal authorities. Within 24 hours, representatives from the Air Force's Project Blue Book arrived to conduct their own examination of the evidence and to interview me in detail. Major Hector Quintanilla, the director of Project Blue Book, personally oversaw the investigation and spent several days in Socorro gathering information. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the scientific consultant for Project Blue Book, also came to Socorro to examine the physical evidence and to evaluate my account. Dr. Hynek was a respected astronomer from Northwestern University who had initially been quite skeptical of UFO reports. However, after spending time at the landing site and conducting extensive interviews with me and the other officers, he concluded that the Socorro case represented a genuine encounter with an unknown craft. The FBI also became involved in the investigation, with Special Agent Arthur Burns conducting his own interviews and evidence analysis. Agent Burns filed a detailed report that supported the authenticity of my account and noted that the physical evidence was consistent with the presence of an unknown aircraft using some form of advanced propulsion system. Laboratory analysis of the charred vegetation revealed that the plants had been exposed to temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than could be produced by any conventional brush fire. The burn patterns showed clear directionality, with the most intense heat damage concentrated at the center of the rectangular landing area and decreasing in intensity toward the periphery. The metallic fragments proved more difficult to analyze. While they appeared to be composed of common elements like aluminum and magnesium, their physical properties were unusual. The material showed remarkable resistance to permanent deformation and displayed what materials scientists called memory characteristics, the to return to original shape after being bent or twisted. Soil samples from the landing impressions showed evidence of exposure to intense pressure and heat. The compacted earth in each impression was much harder than the surrounding soil, as if it had been subjected to tremendous weight and temperature. Spectrographic analysis revealed trace elements that were not naturally occurring in the local soil composition. The Socorro incident received extensive media attention, making headlines in newspapers across the country and attracting investigators from around the world. I was interviewed by reporters from major television networks, national magazines, and international news organizations. While the attention was sometimes overwhelming, I consistently provided the same factual account of what I had witnessed. Some skeptics attempted to explain the incident as a hoax or misidentification, suggesting that I might have encountered an experimental vehicle, a weather balloon, or even college students playing a prank. However, none of these explanations could account for the physical evidence or the performance characteristics of the object I had observed. The landing impressions, burn patterns, and metallic debris were inconsistent with any conventional explanation. Dr. Hynek later wrote that the Socorro case was one of the most convincing UFO encounters he had investigated during his years with Project Blue Book. He noted that my reputation as a reliable police officer, combined with the extensive physical evidence and corroborating witness testimony, made the case extremely difficult to dismiss or debunk. Over the years since the incident, I have been contacted by numerous researchers, investigators, and documentary filmmakers who wanted to re-examine the evidence or create new presentations of the case. I have always been cooperative with serious investigators, though I have grown weary of sensationalists who are more interested in entertainment than in understanding what actually occurred. The Socorro landing site has been visited by thousands of curious people over the decades, and unfortunately much of the original physical evidence has been disturbed or removed by souvenir hunters. However, the basic topography of the area remains unchanged, and investigators can still examine the location where this extraordinary encounter took place. In recent years, as government agencies have become more open about their investigations of unidentified aerial phenomena, the Socorro case has been recognized as one of the most significant encounters in the official record. The combination of credible witness testimony, extensive physical evidence, and thorough official investigation makes it a benchmark case for evaluating other UFO reports. I retired from the Socorro Police Department in 1987, but I continued to live in the community where this remarkable event occurred. Socorro has embraced its connection to UFO history, and the town now hosts an annual UFO festival that attracts visitors from around the world. While I appreciate the economic benefits this brings to our community, I have always emphasized that what I witnessed was not entertainment. It was a genuine encounter with technology that exceeded our understanding. The beings I observed that day appeared to be conducting some kind of scientific mission, perhaps collecting samples or making repairs to their craft. They showed no signs of hostility or aggression, and they departed immediately when they became aware of my presence. Their behavior suggested intelligence and purpose, characteristics that distinguished them from any natural phenomenon or conventional aircraft. The advanced propulsion system demonstrated by their craft, the ability to hover silently, then accelerate to tremendous speeds while making sharp directional changes, represented technology far beyond anything available in 1964. Even today, more than 50 years later, no human-made aircraft can duplicate the performance characteristics I witnessed that afternoon in the New Mexico desert. My encounter at Socorro opened my mind to possibilities I had never previously considered. As a law enforcement officer, I was trained to observe carefully and report accurately, skills that served me well in documenting this extraordinary event. However, the experience also challenged my understanding of what might be possible in our universe and our place within it. The Socorro incident remains an open question in the scientific study of unidentified aerial phenomena. While skeptics continue to propose conventional explanations, none have adequately accounted for all aspects of the physical evidence and witness testimony. The case stands as a reminder that our world may contain mysteries and intelligences that we are only beginning to recognize and understand. Today, as government agencies acknowledge the reality of unexplained aerial phenomena and release previously classified information about UFO investigations, the The Socorro case appears even more significant as an early, well-documented example of contact between humans and non-human intelligence. What I witnessed that day in 1964 may represent one of humanity's first officially recorded encounters with visitors from beyond our world. My name is Janae Carter, and I work as a civilian aircraft maintenance technician at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. I have been employed at the base for 12 years, specializing in avionics systems for cargo and transport aircraft. What I am about to share happened on a clear October night in 2021 when my supervisor, Sergeant Michael Henderson, and I witnessed something that fundamentally challenged everything we thought we knew about aerospace, technology, and government transparency. Wright-Patterson has a long history of involvement with unidentified aerial phenomena, dating back to the 1940s when Project Blue Book was headquartered here. The base houses the National Museum of the United States Air Force, the Air Force Research Laboratory, and numerous classified programs related to advanced aerospace development. Working here, you become accustomed to seeing experimental aircraft and hearing stories about classified projects. But you also learn to distinguish between legitimate military technology and something truly extraordinary. On the evening of October 14th, 2021, I was working a night shift in Hangar 18 performing routine maintenance on the avionics systems of a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. These night shifts were typically quiet, with minimal personnel on base, and most of the aircraft secured for the evening. Sergeant Henderson, who supervises our maintenance operations, was conducting his routine security rounds and checking on the various teams working throughout the facility. Around 11:30, I was calibrating a navigation system when all the electronic equipment in the hangar began experiencing simultaneous malfunctions. Radio communications started crackling with static. Computer screens flickered and went dark, and the overhead lighting began to pulse in an irregular pattern. At first, I assumed we were experiencing some kind of power surge or electrical storm, though the weather had been clear all evening. Sergeant Henderson appeared at my workstation looking concerned and slightly bewildered. "Carter, are you seeing this equipment failure?" he asked, gesturing toward the various electronic systems that were behaving erratically throughout the hangar. I confirmed that I was experiencing the same problems and suggested that we contact the base electrical maintenance team to investigate the power issues. However, as we moved toward the hangar doors to check conditions outside, we noticed something that made us forget about electrical problems entirely. A soft, pulsing light was visible through the high windows of the hangar, casting shifting patterns of illumination across the concrete floor. The light had a quality unlike anything produced by conventional aircraft or ground-based lighting systems. It seemed to pulse with a rhythm that was almost organic, growing brighter and dimmer in slow, regular cycles. Sergeant Henderson and I stepped outside the hangar to investigate the source of this unusual illumination. What we saw suspended above the flight line defied every principle of aerodynamics and propulsion technology I had learned during my years of aircraft maintenance experience. Hovering approximately 300 feet above the tarmac was a craft that appeared to be roughly triangular in shape, with each side measuring perhaps 200 feet in length. The object was completely silent, which was impossible for something that size. Even the quietest military aircraft produced significant noise, but this craft hung motionlessly in the air without creating so much as a whisper of sound. The surface of the craft appeared to be composed of some kind of metallic material that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Instead of conventional navigation lights, the object displayed a series of softly glowing panels arranged along its edges, creating the pulsing illumination we had observed from inside the hangar. Most remarkably, the craft demonstrated flight characteristics that exceeded anything in our current technological capability. As we watched, the object rotated slowly around its vertical axis, revealing different aspects of its geometry. The movement was perfectly smooth and controlled, with none of the mechanical vibration or engine noise that would accompany such maneuvers in any known aircraft. Sergeant Henderson immediately activated his radio to report the sighting to base security, but his communications equipment was producing only static and interference. My cell phone was similarly affected, showing no signal despite being in an area with normally excellent coverage. It was as if the presence of this craft was creating some kind of electromagnetic interference that disrupted all electronic communications in the immediate area. We continued observing the object for perhaps 10 minutes, during which it maintained its position above the flight line while continuing its slow rotation. The craft occasionally pulsed more brightly, and during these moments of increased illumination, we could see additional details of its construction. The surface appeared to have a complex geometric pattern etched or molded into the metallic material, creating designs that seemed to shift and flow as the light intensity changed. Then, without warning, the object began to emit a beam of intense white light directed downward toward the ground. This beam was unlike any searchlight or laser I had ever seen. It was perfectly defined, with sharp edges and uniform intensity throughout its length. The beam swept slowly across the tarmac, seeming to examine or scan the various aircraft and facilities on the flight line. When the beam passed over our position, both Sergeant Henderson and I experienced a strange sensation. It was not painful, but there was a definite tingling feeling throughout our bodies, accompanied by a brief moment of disorientation. The sensation lasted only a few seconds, but it left both of us feeling somehow different, more alert and aware than we had been moments before. The scanning process continued for several minutes, with the beam methodically examining different sections of the base. It paused for extended periods over certain facilities, particularly the research and development buildings where classified aerospace projects are conducted. The intelligence behind this scanning was obvious. This was not random illumination, but purposeful investigation of specific targets. As the beam completed its survey of the base facilities, the craft began to exhibit even more extraordinary capabilities. Instead of ascending gradually like a conventional aircraft, the object simply disappeared from its hovering position and reappeared instantly at a much higher altitude, perhaps 2,000 feet above the base. The transition was instantaneous. There was no visible movement, no acceleration phase, just immediate relocation to a completely different position. From this higher altitude, the craft began to move across the sky at tremendous speed, but in a manner that violated basic principles of physics. Instead of following smooth flight paths that would be necessary for any conventional aircraft, this object made sharp, right-angle turns while maintaining constant velocity. It could stop instantly, reverse direction, and accelerate to incredible speeds without any apparent acceleration period. Sergeant Henderson and I watched this impossible display of aerial maneuvers for another 15 minutes, both of us trying to comprehend what we were witnessing. As experienced aviation professionals, we understood aircraft performance capabilities, and what we were seeing exceeded anything that could be achieved with any known propulsion system or flight control technology. The craft eventually moved beyond our visual range, disappearing toward the northeast at a speed that must have exceeded several thousand miles per hour. As soon as the object departed the area, all of our electronic equipment returned to normal operation. Radio communications resumed, the hangar lighting stabilized, and our various instruments began functioning properly again. We immediately reported the incident to base security and were told that a team would be dispatched to interview us and examine any physical evidence of the encounter. However, when the security team arrived 30 minutes later, we were surprised to discover that they were not regular Air Force security personnel, but rather civilian investigators who refused to identify their specific agency or organization. The lead investigator was a woman in her 40s who introduced herself only as Agent Williams. She was accompanied by two men in dark suits who remained largely silent throughout the interview process. Agent Williams questioned us extensively about every detail of our sighting, taking careful notes and occasionally consulting with her colleagues in hushed conversations. What disturbed both Sergeant Henderson and me was the investigator's apparent familiarity with the type of craft we had described. Agent Williams asked very specific questions about the geometric patterns on the object's surface, the characteristics of the scanning beam, and the electromagnetic interference we had experienced. Her questions suggested that she had encountered similar reports before and was following an established protocol for investigating such incidents. After completing their interviews, the investigators conducted a thorough examination of the hangar and surrounding area. They used various electronic instruments to take readings and measurements, and they collected soil samples from locations where the scanning beam had touched the ground. However, they shared none of their findings with us and provided no explanation of what they were looking for or what they might have discovered. Before departing, Agent Williams informed us that our encounter was classified as a matter of national security and that we were prohibited from discussing the incident with anyone, including other base personnel, family members, or media representatives. She emphasized that violation of this classification could result in serious legal consequences and the loss of our security clearances and employment. The following day, we discovered that the base security cameras that should have recorded the entire incident had mysteriously malfunctioned during the exact time period of our sighting. According to the official maintenance log, all cameras in the area had experienced simultaneous technical failures that resulted in approximately 2 hours of missing footage. The timing of these failures corresponded precisely with the duration of our encounter. More troubling was the discovery that our employment records had been altered overnight. Both Sergeant Henderson and I found that our personnel files now contained additional security classifications and restrictions that had not been present previously. We were both reassigned to different shifts and work areas, effectively separating us and limiting our opportunities to discuss the incident. Over the following weeks, we noticed increased surveillance of our activities both on and off the base. Unfamiliar personnel would appear in our work areas, claiming to be conducting routine inspections or equipment checks. Our phone calls and emails seemed to be monitored, with unusual delays and connection issues that suggested electronic eavesdropping. Despite these intimidation tactics, Sergeant Henderson and I maintained occasional contact and compared our experiences. We both noted that we continued to feel different after our exposure to the scanning beam, more energetic, with enhanced mental clarity and improved physical coordination. We wondered whether the beam had somehow affected us at a biological level, though we had no way to investigate this possibility without attracting unwanted attention. Several months after the incident, I learned through informal channels that similar encounters had occurred at other military installations around the same time period. Personnel at Malmstrom Air Force Base, F.E. Warren Air Force Base, and Naval Air Station Patuxent River had reportedly witnessed comparable craft exhibiting identical flight characteristics and scanning behaviors. This pattern suggested that we had witnessed part of a coordinated surveillance operation, conducted by an intelligence that possessed technology far beyond anything available to human civilization. The systematic nature of these incidents, combined with the government's obvious efforts to suppress information about them, indicated that contact between human and non-human intelligence was occurring on a regular basis. The Wright-Patterson encounter has profoundly affected my understanding of our place in the universe and the true nature of the phenomena we call UFOs. Working at one of the most advanced aerospace research facilities in the world, I had always assumed that any truly revolutionary aircraft technology would originate from human sources. Our encounter demonstrated that there are intelligences operating in our airspace with capabilities that exceed our technology by decades or perhaps centuries. the government's response to our sighting, the immediate classification, the intimidation tactics, the alteration of records, suggests that such encounters are not isolated incidents, but part of an ongoing phenomenon that has been systematically hidden from public awareness. The fact that specialized investigation teams were immediately available to respond to our report indicates that the government has been dealing with such incidents for many years. Today, more than 3 years after the incident, I continue to work at Wright-Patterson, though under much more restrictive conditions than before. I have never again witnessed anything comparable to that October night encounter, but I remain alert to the possibility. The knowledge that non-human intelligence is actively surveying our military installations and aerospace technology has changed my perspective on human civilization and our relationship with the broader universe. The craft we observed that night demonstrated technologies that could revolutionize human transportation, energy production, and our understanding of physics itself. The fact that such capabilities exist, yet remain hidden from public knowledge, represents one of the greatest secrets in human history. Someday, the truth about these encounters will be revealed, and humanity will be forced to confront the reality that we are not alone, and that our visitors possess knowledge and abilities that could transform our species forever.